Right, I think we're ready to get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Rukmini Thakur. I'm an Associate Product Manager at HBS Online. And it's my absolute pleasure to invite you today to this conversation on leadership ethics and corporate accountability with HBS Online Professor Nien-hê Hsieh. So welcome, everyone. Just to lay out the agenda for today, I'll start with a brief intro of Professor Nien-hê. We will then kickstart the conversation with some pre-prepared questions that I have. We will then dive right into a case study. It's a brief case study, which will help us look at some of the tools and techniques that Professor Nien-hê uses in his course. We'll then try and tackle some of the questions that you've already submitted. And then in the final section, we'll open up the floor for Q&A. So our live audience is very welcome to drop in any questions that you might have in the Zoom chat or whichever social media channel you're joining us from. So without further delay, I'm very happy to introduce you to Professor Nien-hê Hsieh. Just to give you his background, Professor Nien-hê Hsieh is the Kim B. Clark Professor of Business Administration in the General Management Unit at Harvard Business School. His research concerns ethical issues in business and the responsibilities of global business leaders. Professor Nien-hê teaches HBS Online's Leadership Ethics and Corporate Accountability course. He's also the course head of Leadership and Corporate Accountability, a program he teaches to first-year MBA students and executive education participants. Now that was a pretty formal introduction, I'd like to invite Professor Nien-hê to give us a little bit of his background, maybe share some of your research and interests, and just talk about what got you interested in this subject matter. For those who don't know, Professor Nien-hê shares a really fascinating story about his career path in the online course. So Professor, if you could share some of that with our viewers here, that would be wonderful.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me and for the opportunity to speak to you. So very much looking forward to this. I thought I might start actually by sharing something that is sort of in the middle of my career. So when I graduated from Swarthmore College, which is a small liberal arts college outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, I made two promises to myself as a graduate. One was not to move back to Philadelphia, to go somewhere else in the world. And two was not to become an academic. 9 years later, I started my first job as an assistant professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, which is located conveniently right in Philadelphia. So clearly, as you can tell from the story, I'm not one to keep my promises. And so that's why I often tell this story when people ask me why I teach ethics, because there is that saying that those who can't do, teach. But more seriously, though, ethics, I think for me, has always been at the forefront of my growing up. My father was a professor of physics at the University of Arizona. And growing up, every month, we received the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And for those of you who might not be familiar, this was a magazine that featured on its front cover the famous doomsday clock, illustrating how many minutes we were away from something like nuclear war based on the estimates of risk that the scientists made, given the overall environment that we were operating in. And so this, for me, really symbolized the importance of ethics, right? Because ethics is about common values, practices, and principles for how we ought to treat one another. And here, the doomsday clock was an illustration of what would happen if we didn't have that common understanding, shared values, or principles. And getting it wrong was existentially threatening. And I can't tell you how much as a young child that clock and what it meant sort of symbolized to me the importance of trying to get things right in terms of ethics. And I was very fortunate that I grew up with a very good and strong example of how to do that. So my father came from China to study in the United States and ended up in the University of Chicago to study physics. And while he was there in graduate school, he met the woman who was to become my mother. Now, she had actually come from Japan to study graduate social work at the University of Chicago. And for those of you who are familiar with the history of East Asia, it's highly unlikely that the two of them ever would have met or get married. And yet here they were, falling in love and finding a way to find a common set of values, a common set of ways of treating one another, right? That stood above the differences that they had historically. And so for me, that's always stood out then as a great example of how we can do ethics when things are done right. And so I hope that gives you a sense of sort of my interest in ethics, then why something like business and why something like leadership ethics and corporate accountability. I guess what I want to say about that is, if we think about the economy and how we've organized business, it's pretty amazing. So just to take an example, I'm talking to you in front of my computer. It's an Apple iMac. It's designed in Cupertino, California. It's manufactured in China with parts and materials sourced from companies all around the world. And it's running software designed not just by Apple, but many other companies as well. So it's a truly innovative product that allows me to do a great many things all through business and markets, bringing together people, resources, capital to manufacture and innovate in ways that don't require any single one individual or company or government to put it all together. So that's the amazing thing that fascinates me about the world of business. But at the same time, the computer probably contains copper and cobalt mined by people, say, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there are concerns about maybe human rights violations in mining or potential corruption. It's an expensive product. Not everybody can afford it. And there's certainly inequality more generally as far as we think about the digital world. And what's the environmental impact of either making this computer or when I dispose of it? And also, if you think about how computers can be used, say in the case of social media, there's disinformation, bullying, questions about mental health. And so on the one hand, there are these great benefits and possibilities, but on the other, there's this real potential for risks and harm. And so for me, trying to think about how can we help business leaders determine and deliver on their responsibilities in the context of these complex trade-offs, that's what really drew me to leadership ethics and corporate accountability.
Thank you, Professor Nien-hê. That was very enlightening. It's really nice to know your personal story as well, because I also feel principles and ethics come from a very personal place. So to know where you sort of got your motivation from is very eye-opening. Now that we know a little bit more about you, we would love to know a little bit more about the Leadership Ethics Corporate Accountability course. So if you could speak a little bit about the course, just to give our viewers some understanding of what the course entails.
Absolutely. So the course is designed around what you might call gray area decisions, which are decisions facing business leaders where there are conflicting responsibilities. There's real pressure and oftentimes real uncertainty about either the outcome of decisions or even in terms of the actual standards that apply. And so what's best for an organization from the leader's perspective in terms of, say, its financial performance, right, might then raise legal complications or ethical considerations. And so the idea behind the course is to help managers how to navigate these kinds of gray area situations by learning about their economic, legal, and ethical responsibilities. And that course is designed to do just that. But it's really designed also in that process for current and aspiring managers to learn about their own personal commitments, right? Working through those economic, legal, and ethical responsibilities, because often it's the case, right, that having worked through your economic, legal, and ethical responsibilities, there's more than one right answer that presents itself. And that's where your personal commitments come into play. And so part of what I hope the course does, right, in working through these tough gray area decisions is to help you determine your own sort of framework in terms of how to think about making these difficult decisions. And in addition then to sort of being aware of your responsibilities, making a judgment about your decision and what to do. Thirdly, the course is also about how to take action in a way that is accountable to the various stakeholders in your situation?
Yes, I think you bring up a very important point, and we're going to speak to this a little bit more in a little while about the frameworks. Before that, I just want to get some details out there. For those who are wondering, the HBS Online Leadership Ethics and Corporate Accountability course is a 6-week self-paced program, and it has 5 modules, each of which take about 7 to 9 hours, with a total time commitment of about 40 to 50 hours. And if any of you are wondering, it costs $1,750. So I just wanted to get those details out there and now go right back to the course. Professor, you hinted about some of the frameworks, how people can make their own frameworks. I know that in this course there are very many interesting frameworks that you've used, including the reflective leadership model, for instance. Could you speak to one of these frameworks, perhaps the reflective leadership model, just to give our viewers an idea of the toolkit that they might see on offer in the course?
Absolutely. So one way to think about the course is through this framework of reflective leadership. And reflective leadership, in a way, is not that different or distinct from decision-making in general. So if you think about decision-making in general, one way you might think about decision-making is in terms of awareness, right? Being aware of the various kinds of considerations that you need to take into account. Secondly, then engaging in a kind of a judgment, right? Trying to determine what you should do given those considerations. And then thirdly, right, taking a course of action, right? How to follow through on that decision. What makes reflective leadership distinctive from a general kind of thinking about decision-making is that when we ask in the first question about awareness, right, it's not just what are the relevant considerations, but also, more importantly, what are my responsibilities? Secondly, in terms of judgment, we don't simply ask what should we do, right, but really trying to make explicit, in some sense, those personal commitments, those value judgments that ought to inform that decision. And then in terms of action, right, the question isn't simply how will we do it, but how can we do it with accountability? So that is the idea behind reflective leadership. In terms of other kinds of frameworks, let me share a few more. One is to sort of reiterate, right, that throughout the course, when we think about responsibilities, it's not just in terms of economic responsibilities, right, but also legal responsibilities. And even if something is legal, there is that question, really, is it ethical? Then in terms of the first module, one framework that might be helpful to think about is what you do in the context of information asymmetry when buying or selling with regard to another party. Because in every situation, there will always be information asymmetry, and sellers often have more information than buyers. So the first question then is, how much information are you required to share? Say, for example, from the perspective of legal regulations or requirements in terms of disclosure. But then secondly, you still have a lot of discretion once you meet the legal threshold. So then the question is, what should you do? And there in the module, we try to analyze it by looking at, one, the nature of the relationship with the other party. Are they a client? Are they a customer? Are they a counterparty? In which case, we think that the responsibilities that you have in terms of sharing information are quite different. And then secondly, trying to understand what exactly is ethically wrong in terms of being somewhat dishonest in various situations. And so that's sort of one framework that we use in the context of information asymmetry in the customer module. Then in terms of the responsibilities to society module, which is towards the end of the course, the framework there is slightly different from, I think, other kinds of corporate responsibility frameworks you might be familiar with, say, for example, like stakeholder management or corporate social responsibility. The idea here is actually to start with the idea that you as a manager and a leader are also a member of society. And so then the question then is to ask yourself, as a member of society, how do I understand my responsibilities to society, and what kind of a society do I want to live in? So I hope that's helpful in giving you a sense of some of the other kinds of frameworks that will come up in the context of the course, in addition to the reflective leadership framework.
Yes, I think that's super interesting. Also want to just highlight to the folks listening in today, if you want more information or want to see what kind of frameworks we have in this course, you can always go to our website, online.hbs.edu. We also have an insights tab with a lot of interesting content on very many different issues, including ethical issues and the like. But now, without delaying it any further, I think a lot of our participants are probably very excited to dive into the case study. And so the case for today is charity versus bribery. And I'm not going to take too much time. Professor Nien-hê, I'll hand it over to you to just set up the case and talk us through how one would think about making a decision in a sticky spot, in a gray area situation. I'll hand it over to you.
Great. No, thanks. Thanks very much. So the case is titled Charity or Bribery. And just to be clear, it's what we call sort of a composite case here at Harvard Business School. So in other words, it's based on real events and also based on the author's background and research experience in terms of describing a real life situation. But it's not based on interviews or a field study or an exact same case. In other words, it's somewhat disguised in a certain kind of case. So the case is set in Poland, and the case protagonist is Philip. His parents died from lung cancer when he was very young, and he studied to become a doctor and then joined the Polish subsidiary of an American pharmaceutical company as a high-profile sales manager. So his job as a sales manager for this Polish subsidiary of the American pharmaceutical company is to win contracts for sale of medicines to state health departments in Poland. So now, while attending various fairs and trade expositions to sort of make connections, he meets Alex. Now, Alex is the regional health director for the southeast area of Poland, and he oversees drug purchasing by the state for that region in southeast Poland. Now, the two of them hit it off because it turns out Philip and Alex are from the same region, and Alex also studied medicine. And before Alex became the regional health director for Southeast Poland, he started a foundation called the Wellness Foundation to improve health and well-being in the region where both Philip and Alex grew up. And so then when he became a regional health director, he basically handed over the day-to-day management of the Wellness Foundation to his co-founders. 1 year later, in June of 2016, Philip receives a letter from the regional health department explaining that they were going to review bids for a range of drug purchases, which would begin soon. Now, the process would take a number of months to complete, and the letter is signed by Alex as the regional health director. So Philip submits a bid to sell medicines to the Southeast Regional Health Department based upon the kinds of products that the healthcare company has to offer. The next month, in July of 2016, the Southeast region is especially hard hit by flooding. And roads are washed out, towns are submerged, and there's a real risk of a hepatitis A outbreak. And so in his capacity as founder of the Wellness Foundation, Alex calls Philip asking if Philip or his company would be interested in donating either cash for immediate relief or medicines to help with the potential hepatitis A outbreak. Now, Philip shares the request with his supervisor, and his supervisor delegates authority to Philip to make the decision. The company historically has engaged in a wide range of charitable activities, including giving money, as well as medicines in cases of things like natural disasters. And so then the question is, if you were in Philip's shoes, what would you do? So the first thing is to sort of think about awareness. And one thing we might do is sort of walk through the economic, legal, and ethical considerations with regard to the decision of whether or not to respond to the request from Alex in his capacity as the director of the Wellness Foundation for donations to address the humanitarian issues coming up in the context as a result of the flooding. So from the economic perspective, you might ask, how much would the donation cost? How much money could we reasonably afford to give, or how much of our medication could we reasonably afford to provide for free? You might also ask, from an economic perspective, what are the potential benefits to the company from good PR resulting from making this kind of donation, either in terms of money or in terms of medicine? And you also might say to yourself, is there a benefit to the company that results from strengthening our relationship with Alex in his capacity as the regional health director in the time for when the bid might come up? Now, from a legal perspective, it doesn't appear that there's anything illegal about donating in this situation. You might ask, from a legal perspective, what the form of the donation might take. So if you're concerned, for example, about money being diverted from the charity, right, you might think it's better to provide it not in terms of money, but rather think in terms of providing medications. And even if there is medication, however, you might still worry about, does this look like a bribe to win the contract? Because like in most countries, bribery is illegal if it's a kind of a quid pro quo. In other words, it's illegal if it is done in a way that is conditional on trying to receive the benefit. So you might ask, is donating money or medicines to the Wellness Foundation, does this look like a kind of a quid pro quo where we're doing so in order to then win the bid that we just put in a month ago? But that also raises the question then, well, why is it illegal? And that sort of brings us to the question of what's the underlying ethical rationale that people have for making something like bribery illegal. And people generally cite kind of two ethical rationales. One is that official corruption and bribery involves an abuse by a government official or authority of the trust that's put in them by the citizens. Because on the one hand, right, the trust that's being put into the government official by the citizens is to make decisions and carry them out in ways that benefit citizens. In the case of bribery, what's happening is that the government official is abusing that trust and their authority by taking decisions that are in their own interest, that are potentially at the detriment of the citizens. And so Philip, by engaging in bribery, is in some sense complicit in supporting this abuse of trust and authority by the government official. And from the perspective of the company and Philip, people argue that bribery, in order to gain contracts, is unfair to competitors because you're winning business not on the merits, but by paying a bribe. And you might also, in fact, even be harming your customers because they may be paying more for the products or services that you're offering for them, or in some sense, they may actually be getting substandard products or services. So that's why people from an ethical perspective might object to bribery. But at the same time, it seems like there are good ethical reasons to provide the donation. There's a real need as a result of the flooding. And finally, recall that idea about personal commitments. Personal commitments are things that are important to us that help guide our decision-making when we have a range of choices from which to choose. And for Philip, he has a personal commitment precisely to this region because that's where he grew up. So I hope that gives you a sense of how we might think about the ethical, economic, and legal considerations in terms of awareness. Then in terms of judgment, I think people might say, well, this really isn't a quid pro quo because he's not making any demands of actually winning the bid in exchange for providing the donation. And so it seems like it's a good thing to do. And he can make clear that this is not a bribe. So that's the judgment piece. Then in terms of action, how can he do this in a way that's accountable, but also might avoid some of the complications that might arise if somebody were to think this is a bribe? So I think the first thing he might want to do, or you might want to do in this situation, is to engage in your due diligence on the Wellness Foundation. Is it a legitimate foundation? Is it well run? Are they in a position to actually use the medication in a way to help address the hepatitis A outbreak? You would want to check with your company policies and with your company supervisor with regard to when is it appropriate and how is it appropriate to engage in these kinds of charitable donations. You might want to ensure that the delivery reaches the Wellness Foundation. You might even personally accompany it if you wanted to do that. And you want to document everything to make sure that you're doing it in a way that is accountable. You might also then want to monitor and check up with the Wellness Foundation. And then finally, you might want to put into place some contingencies. So for example, if you find out that there are some problems with the foundation, are there ways to take back the donation? And so that is a way of thinking about the question of action. So we have awareness, judgment, and then action. So with that, let me share with you what happened. Philip took the steps as we just described, and then 6 months later, he was informed that his company was awarded one of the contracts with the regional health department. The next month, however, an investigative report in the newspaper came out connecting the vaccination campaign for hepatitis A run by the Wellness Foundation, to which the company had donated, and the company being awarded a contract by the regional health director, who happened to have set up the Wellness Foundation. And so the newspaper report is alleging a potential quid pro quo in this situation. And then the week after that, Philip is informed by his supervisor that the company was being investigated by the US parent company about charitable donations in potential violation of the United States Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And so the question is, could Philip have done anything differently to avoid this problem? And how serious is the situation facing him and the company now? And what can he do in that context? So in terms of takeaways of the case and the case discussion, normally we'd have it over the course of a class. I'd like to highlight for you sort of 5 takeaways that I hope people will take away from the context of this case when we discuss it in the context more generally. So the first is to reiterate that bribery and official corruption are problems around the world, including here in the United States. And it's not just a quote unquote developing economy problem. It's not just something that quote unquote people do over there because that's how things are done. So I think that's the first thing I want to take out from the context of the case. Second, there are serious consequences that result from bribery and official corruption. So some estimates put the amount of bribes paid at around $1 trillion per year. Some estimates say that bribery and official corruption add 10% to the total cost of doing business and 25% to the cost of procurement contracts in developing economies. Corruption in many countries is associated with higher infant mortality rates. And in the United States, there's about a 5 to 10% loss, people estimate, to Medicare and Medicaid because of fraud. So there are real consequences to engaging in bribery and corruption for society. And the third point is that from a legal perspective, almost every country makes it illegal to engage in bribery. But the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which comes up at the end of the case, is a particularly powerful legal instrument because what it allows the US government to do is to pursue cases of bribery and corruption to foreign officials in other countries, as long as it's around activity that involves an American business interest, which may be a subsidiary, for example, of an American company. Fourth, but you might say, what about the benefit to the companies? Isn't there a reason that companies engage in this kind of behavior? And here, what I want to point out is evidence suggests that bribery may not be as beneficial to companies as people might normally expect. First, the fines can be quite high. So in 2020, for example, Goldman Sachs was fined $2.9 billion for bribes paid to win businesses in Malaysia. Airbus that year was fined $3.9 billion for a global scheme to win contracts around the world. Secondly, in one study, showed that companies that pay bribes in high corruption areas and companies that have maybe less stringent anti-corruption policies, they may see higher growth in sales than companies that do have stringent anti-corruption policies. But it turns out that the sales growth is much less profitable. And in some sense, if you think about it, that kind of makes intuitive sense, because part of what's going into gaining those sales, right, is having to pay out for bribes, and so therefore they might be less profitable to the company. And third, in lots of surveys, employees report a severe loss of morale when they find out that senior officials in the company are engaged in paying bribes. And that's independent of the size of the bribe paid. So it may not be as beneficial to companies from an economic perspective to engage in these practices. And then fifth, what should you do as a leader to help avoid these kinds of situations? And for those of you familiar with the fraud triangle, one way we might do this is to think in terms of the 3 points of the fraud triangle. Right? So if you recall, the fraud triangle says that there's sort of 3 things that are associated with fraud. One is pressure, the second one is rationalization, and the third one is opportunity. So in the case of bribery or official corruption, you might want to limit pressure on people. So set realistic sales targets, emphasize quality, not growth. In terms of limiting the potential for rationalization, you'd want to set clear expectations, guidelines, and training. And then third, in terms of limiting opportunity, you have to invest in appropriate controls. So I hope that gives you a sense for the kinds of discussions that we might have in the context of leadership ethics and corporate accountability. And I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Nien-hê. That was really, really eye-opening. I think usually when we're in like ethical dilemmas or any of these situations, logic kind of goes out of the window and we're kind of like grappling with whatever we have. So it's always handy to have these frameworks, I feel, which can just help you think methodically about a situation in a sort of nerve-wracking time. So thank you for that. Now we'll dive into some questions that were pre-submitted to us. We'll deal with those first. So the first question we have is from Habib, and he asks, how do you manage the risk of unintended consequences when making a decision?
It's a great question. And I think certainly in talking with people, that question becomes ever more pressing in certain areas, given the speed with which technology is changing and the kind of outsized impact, right, that companies can have in this kind of global digital world. I guess what I would say is we should first be pretty clear on what we mean by an unintended consequence. And there, what I want to do is push a distinction between something being unintended and something being unforeseeable. Because oftentimes when we say we're worried about unintended consequences, right, they actually are things that may have been foreseeable, but simply what we didn't really want as a result of our action. So traffic examples might be a useful example, right? We don't intend traffic accidents, right? We don't want them to happen, right, as part of having cars on the road, right? But they certainly are foreseeable in the sense that we have good reason to believe that something like that may happen. And so that's an example of what you might call something that's foreseeable but unintended, right? And those, I think, are the kinds of consequences that we have something to focus on. So then the first thing to ask is, okay, in the case of it's foreseeable but unintended, is it really actually unintended, in the sense that maybe there's certain kinds of things that we may not want to have happen, but they kind of have to happen if we are going to be able to get things out? And so I think it's the first question you want to really ask yourself: to what extent is this something, if it were to happen, right? If it didn't happen, in other words, would it change the success of our goal? So take this for traffic accidents again. If no traffic accidents happened, that would not change anything at all, right, with regard to how successful was our introduction of cars. But there are other kinds of things, say, for example, in social media, think about sort of addiction, right? Or think about, for example, the potential for bullying. Right? You might say, well, these are things that we don't want to have happen, right? But at the same time, it's not clear that the model could be so successful if it didn't have these kinds of things there as well. Is that the case? And so that's an example of how I think we want to think about really going through these kinds of decisions, and then finally then developing a sort of a contingency plan for addressing them.
Thank you. I'm going to dive right into the next question just because we're coming up on time. We have one question from Pati on Zoom, and this kind of ties into some other questions we've received earlier as well. Pati asks, within a business context, the responsibility for establishing a shared understanding usually aligns with individuals at various levels of the hierarchy. What is the difference between person responsible versus person accountable when making a final ethical decision? And while you're answering this, I just want to wrap in like one or two other things that other participants in the same context wanted to know about. Any possible like negotiation, how do you handle it when there is a conflict between personal and organizational values, or how does negotiation really come into play? So I'll just wrap those up for you.
No, those are great questions. I guess what I'd say quickly is this. First, when we talk about sort of either personal responsibility or sort of personal commitments or personal values, we should be very clear of our personal commitments when I talked about earlier is what we're talking about aren't just things that are purely personal in the sense that it's just me and that's why it's important, but it's the kind of thing that you could imagine somebody else also caring about, and it's something else that you can also explain to other people. So I think it's actually very important to sort of make sure that's the kind of thing that we're talking about, because if it's just simply about me, right, and it's not really important to anybody else, then it's not clear actually why we should worry about the stakes for that. So that's sort of one thing I want to say about there as well. And so in terms of trying to address that potential conflict, one thing is you want to think a little bit about, well, what am I sacrificing from the perspective of those important values, because they are in some sense values that other people might also share as well? And is there a way that I can then sort of actually, and then the question is, what do I do, right? And I think there a useful framework is thinking about sort of this idea between exit, loyalty, and voice. And is it something I think you have to exit because there's no way you can resolve it and it's too important? Or is it the kind of thing where you think, no, actually I can resolve it and I can sort of stay here and sort of stay loyal? Or third, is it something that I should sort of speak up about and sort of exercise a kind of voice? Because if it's not just purely personal, but something that other people can care about, that gives you the possibility then for voice. In terms of the distinction then between personal responsibility and I guess personal accountability, I guess what I want to say something like is that personal responsibility is something that that results from your having been in some sense either causing something or causing something to happen, or maybe causing something not to happen, right? So that's the idea behind responsibilities. In other words, are you responsible for something in that kind of way? Accountability is slightly different. I think there may be things in an organization that you aren't personally responsible for having had happened, but because you are a business leader in the organization, you will be held accountable for them. And that, I think, is precisely why, right, creating that right kind of organizational culture is so important, where people who are making those decisions that they may be personally responsible for, but you are being held accountable for, will then basically line up.
Thank you. I want to take up one more question. This is from Lawrence on LinkedIn. And Lawrence says, the ethical, legal, and economic responsibilities are complex. How do you measure success in meeting each of these elements when applied in real life experiences? So more to like assessment and how do you know whether you've done the right thing?
Great. So I think there are a few ways to think about it in the context of the course. One is you might think of the ethical lens and the legal lens and the economic lens as literally kinds of lenses that overlap in terms of Venn diagram. And the measure of success, and in some sense the mark of a really skillful manager or leader, is somebody who manages to find a solution that exists in some sense at the intersection of all three. But that requires real skill and judgment. So that's sort of one way to think about, are we doing that? I think the second way to understand then measuring, thinking about success more concretely, is to ask yourself, if we think about this from an economic perspective, right? and a legal perspective and an ethical perspective, we have to ask ourselves, what is our criteria for success as an organization? In other words, we sort of set the lenses aside for a moment and say, look, what do we think is successful? Right? That, I think, is actually a helpful way to do it, because oftentimes I think people end up doing things that they either regret or would not have done otherwise because they thought they had to do it or should do it, when in fact, if they really thought about their definition of success, they really wouldn't have had to do that activity.
Wonderful. There's one question that I really want to take up. I know we're almost at time, but there were a few people who asked about this. And the question is, how do you see the future of leadership and ethics regarding the new work with AI? Great
question. If I could predict the answer to that question, you're very wealthy. Look, I think there are a few things I want to point out. First of all, is I think the question for how to implement technology and AI, especially in organizations, in ways that are beneficial to workers and helping them to do their jobs better. And I think that's one thing that leaders really need to think seriously about, especially with the speed at which generative AI, for example, is developing into ways that we never really thought that could be done in terms of the context of work. So I think that's sort of the first thing, sort of think about the responsibility with regard to employees in the context of the firm. The second, I think, area that we're going to see real questions about ethics and leadership is, this may take a little bit of time to articulate, but to think a little bit, not just about how it affects the ways people work, but how does the implementation of ethics and AI affect the interactions and relationships that you as a company have with customers. And what I mean by this is this, because obviously customers want to trust organizations, and so the question is, can they trust AI? I think that's sort of a primary question. But the secondary question is, what is happening to our customers in terms of how they see themselves the more and more they have to deal, say, for example, with AI? Because I think there's a sense in which customers prefer to interact with individuals oftentimes because they're recognized by the other person as being a person. AI, at least as far as I understand it, doesn't recognize us as persons in the same kind of way. And so one question then is, do customers care, right, about not being seen or recognized as a person? And what does that then do for how customers see themselves? So that's kind of the second area where I think leaders really need to think about the question of AI. And then the third one is that I think AI, actually, I believe, if we think about it seriously, will actually push us to think more clearly about what it means to be accountable as a leader. Because at the end of the day, no matter how much advice or information, plans we get from AI, at the end of the day, it's the leader or the manager who has to make the decision and is going to be held accountable for it. And so in a way, I'd like to think that AI, in some sense, actually helps us to think more critically about what it means to be human.
Thank you so much, Professor Nien-hê. That was so interesting. Thank you very much for your time. We're at time now, so we'll wrap this up. It was very insightful. Thank you to our viewers for joining. And please reach out to us if you have any other questions. You can get our email address on our website, or reach out to us on any of the social media channels. But thank you, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.